Welcome to GPOguide.com, session number 100.5, Understanding Domain Account Policy. In this session, I'm going to cover sort of the ins and outs of domain account policies, about defining account policy for user accounts in an Active Directory environment, as well as the difference between that and defining account policy for local accounts, or accounts that reside on member servers and workstations. As you can see here, I've got Group Policy Management Console up and running, and I have my cpandle.com domain. And at the domain level, I have actually two GPOs linked. I have the default domain policy, which is a special GPO that gets created in every single Active Directory installation that you'll do. And I have a GPO that I created called the Domain User Logon Script GPO. For right now, let's focus on the default domain policy. Just a word about this GPO. This is a special GPO within Active Directory. You probably don't want to delete it or unlink it from the domain, but otherwise it doesn't need any special care other than that. I would recommend that if you're modifying the default domain policy, that each time you make a modification, you use GPMC to back it up before you make that modification. You can do that simply by going down to the group policy object container in GPMC and going to the default domain policy and right-clicking on it and saying back up. And that's really all there is to it. Now let's go back up and focus on these domain-linked GPOs. Why these are important is because when you're defining account policy on the domain, in other words, things like minimum password length or password complexity for domain user accounts or user accounts that are defined within Active Directory. When you want to define those policies, you must do it on a GPO that is linked at the domain level. That is the only level at which domain account policy can be defined. Any other account policy that you try to set at OU levels, like the admin container here or the domain controllers container, if you try to define account policy at those levels, it's simply ignored. So let's go in and open up the default domain policy. And what you see is, we've got a little screen refresh challenge here, but let's go ahead and get into Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Account Policies. And what you see here is there's three containers under there where you can define things like password policy, minimum length, minimum age, maximum age, complexity, account lockout, how long an account should be locked out for, what the reset count or what the lockout threshold is, and Kerberos policy, which relates to some of the parameters around Kerberos-based authentication in Active Directory. Now, you see that this policy area falls under computer configuration. So that should tell you that only computer objects will process account policy. Now, this seems kind of counterintuitive because you're managing essentially user objects, or you're managing user accounts, but you're managing the policy that applies to those user accounts, and therefore it's applied only by computers, or it's processed only by computers. Now I'll explain this a little bit more in a second, but essentially when you're defining account policy, you're defining it here, and as you can see, this default domain policy has a set of policy settings that have already been set. When you define or when you install Active Directory, you're going to get a set of default account policy settings, just as you see here, and these in effect are the effective user account policy for domain user accounts. So if I were to log on to a workstation using my Active Directory user account, I would have to have at least an 8-character password. I would need it to be complex, and it would be remembered. 24 of my previous passwords would be remembered. So this GPO, this default domain policy GPO, because it's linked to the domain, effectively controls what my domain user account policy is. Now let me go back to the GPMC. I have this other GPO called Domain User Logon Script. It's not very well named, but the point here is that I could, if I didn't want to define account policy within the default domain policy, I could define it within this GPO. Now, because it's already defined the default domain policy, you saw those settings for 8-character minimum password, etc. that is going to apply unless I change the order of processing. So what I've done here is I've moved the the domain user logon script up to the top of the link order so that it's processed after the default domain policy, and any account policy settings like password length that are defined in this domain user logon script GPO would actually take effect. They would be the effective account policy for my domain user accounts. Now, let's talk about what is processing these policies that makes this effective for the domain. Well, most logically, it's the domain controllers in your domain that are looking to the GPOs linked at the domain level for account policy. They will only look at GPOs linked at the domain level. So let's assume that all of your domain controllers are stored in this domain controllers OU. They're actually going to ignore any account policy that might be defined on this other special GPO that comes with AD called the default domain controllers policy. If I were to define account policy like password length in this GPO, the domain controllers are going to ignore it because it's not linked to the domain. They're going to ignore it and they're going to say, no, really what I want is what's up here in default domain policy, or in the case of my domain user logon script, I'm going to process that as well because it's also linked to the domain. So effective domain user account policy can only be delivered by a GPO linked at the domain level. Another thing that you've probably heard about account policy is that you can only have one account policy for a domain. You can't say, I want to have my sales users have a different minimum password length than my admin users. There's only one password policy that will be read linked at the domain level for domain user accounts, or one effective password policy. There are some third-party products on the market that let you do some password filtering to get around this limitation, but until Longhorn Server ships, Windows Server 2003 or Windows 2000 will not support more than a single password policy or account policy per domain. And that's just the way it is. Now what you can do is you can define different account policies for member server and workstation local accounts. So for example, every workstation has a local administrator account or a power users account. I'm sorry, that's a group. Any number of other local accounts that you might have defined on your member servers or workstations. And you can have different password policy for those from what domain user accounts have. And you would do that simply the way you would normally do group policy processing, which is you would go to an OU where you have some workstations or member servers stored, and you create a GPO linked to that OU, and you go ahead and edit that GPO, and you say, for the local accounts that exist on these workstations, in other words, not domain accounts, but local user accounts, I want to set a different password policy. And I want that password policy to have minimum 7-character password length, not 8. And so when the workstations in this OU go to process this policy, they will process it last after this default domain policy, because they're getting this anyway. They're processing this default domain policy just the way they would normally, because in domain group policy processing precedence, local GPOs process first, then site link GPOs, then domain link GPOs, and finally OU link GPOs. So these workstations are going to process the policy, the account policy that's defined in this default domain policy object, just like domain controllers will. But then they're going to process the security policy, and it's going to change the minimum password length for local user accounts on those workstations. So let me just review this. When I create my account policy settings in the domain linked GPO, this is going to, in the absence of any other account policy in the domain, this is going to affect two different sets of user accounts. This is going to be processed by domain controllers and affect domain user accounts. And it's going to be processed by any other computers in the domain that receive or process that default domain policy. and it's going to affect their local user accounts. So in the absence of any other account policy, this one default domain policy is affecting all computers in the domain, both local and domain accounts. Now, if I want to have different password policies for local accounts, not domain accounts, but local accounts, I can create GPOs that set different account policies and link those to the appropriate OUs down within the AD tree. So, while I can only have one account policy for domain user accounts, the user account, the Active Directory user account that I use to log on to the domain, I can have multiple account policies for workstation or member server local accounts if I need to do that. I could have this security policy linked to this workstation's OU and the marketing OU, and I could come up and have a different password policy for member server local accounts within the engineering OU. So there is some flexibility there in terms of managing account policy on local accounts, but with respect to domain account policy and domain user accounts, they can only be set on GPOs linked at the domain, and they will only be processed by domain controllers within that domain. That concludes this session.